The moment Teyana Taylor allegedly decided she was done protecting the silence, everything shifted. Not a leak. Not a slip. A line in the sand. Insiders say what she revealed privately, and what she allegedly threatened to reveal publicly, sent shockwaves through rooms that were never meant to feel pressure. Because this wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about petty fallout. It was about leverage. According to whispers now circulating behind the scenes, Teyana didn't expose a scandal for attention. She exposed a truth Aaron never thought would surface. A truth so tightly controlled that even hinting at it reportedly changed the power dynamic instantly. Phones rang. Meetings stopped. Conversations went quiet. People who were confident hours earlier suddenly got cautious. What makes this explosive isn't what the secret allegedly is, it's why it mattered. Insiders claim it wasn't something illegal, but something far more dangerous in celebrity spaces, a contradiction. A carefully maintained image versus a reality that didn't match. And Teyana, according to sources, made it clear she was no longer willing to absorb the consequences of protecting that contradiction. The threat wasn't shouted. It was implied. Calm. Deliberate. The kind that says, if I speak, everything you've built gets questioned. And that's when Aaron's posture reportedly changed. Not anger. Not denial. Stillness. Because when someone holds information that reframes a narrative, silence becomes strategy, not strength. Fans felt it instantly. The energy shifted. The confidence drained. The story stopped being about a quiet ending and started being about what was being kept quiet. And once that door cracked open, the internet did what it always does, it leaned in. Because when someone finally stops protecting the story that protected you, what comes next is never small. The alleged threat didn't come from anger, it came from exhaustion. According to insiders close to the situation, Teyana Taylor reached a point where protecting Pierre's silence began costing her more than exposing it ever could. What made this moment so destabilizing wasn't volume or theatrics. It was intent. She wasn't lashing out. She was withdrawing protection. Sources say the secret itself wasn't criminal, scandalous, or tabloid-ready in the traditional sense. It was structural. A contradiction between the image Aaron had carefully maintained and the reality of how he moved behind the scenes. The kind of contradiction that doesn't destroy someone overnight, but quietly dismantles credibility once people start noticing it. According to whispers circulating in industry circles, Teyana allegedly realized she had been carrying narrative weight that wasn't hers to carry. While Aaron benefited from ambiguity, restraint, and silence, she absorbed speculation, judgment, and assumption. And the more she watched the public sympathize with his quiet posture, the clearer it became that silence was working, just not for her. Insiders say that realization marked a turning point. Rather than confront him emotionally, Teyana allegedly confronted the imbalance. She reportedly made it clear that if she was going to continue being framed as the decisive one, the complicated one, or the one who moved on, then she would no longer shield the context that made those choices necessary. The threat wasn't to embarrass him. It was to restore symmetry. People close to the situation describe the moment as calm but final. No shouting. No ultimatums. Just a clear boundary. Don't mistake my silence for consent to be misrepresented. That's when Aaron, according to insiders, went quiet in a different way. Not the composed quiet fans were used to, but a guarded one. The kind that signals awareness of risk. What made this especially potent is that the alleged secret didn't need receipts to matter. It didn't require screenshots or confessions. It was about pattern. About how Aaron allegedly navigated proximity without commitment, visibility without vulnerability, and connection without consequence. Once that pattern is articulated by someone who lived inside it, the narrative shifts instantly. Insiders say Teyana understood that power. She allegedly recognized that the truth she held wasn't explosive because of content, it was explosive because of contrast. The contrast between who Aaron was perceived to be and how he actually moved when no one was watching. And in celebrity culture, contrast is lethal. It forces re-evaluation. The alleged threat, according to sources, wasn't "I'll expose you." It was "I won't protect you anymore." And that distinction matters. Because protecting silence is labor. Emotional labor. Reputational labor. And once that labor is withdrawn, the story doesn't need to be told, it begins telling itself. People notice gaps, inconsistencies, changes in posture. The confidence that once felt grounded starts to feel calculated. Fans sensed it almost immediately. According to observers, Aaron's energy shifted. Less ease. Less assurance. Fewer carefully neutral statements. Not because he was guilty of something specific, but because he could no longer rely on Teyana's discretion to maintain the framing. When someone stops covering for your narrative, even unintentionally, the room changes. Insiders claim this is why no public denial ever came. Denying would require specificity. Specificity would invite scrutiny. And scrutiny would lead people exactly where Aaron allegedly didn't want them looking, at how much of his image relied on others staying quiet. Teyana's role in this phase wasn't vindictive. Sources say she didn't want chaos. She wanted correction. She wanted the narrative to stop simplifying her choices while sanctifying his restraint. If the public was going to analyze her actions, she was no longer willing to let his go unexamined. That's why the alleged threat shocked people who heard about it. Not because it was cruel, but because it was precise. It wasn't "I'll ruin you." It was "I'll tell my side." And in a story built almost entirely on implication, that alone was destabilizing enough to change everything. By the end of this first phase, insiders say the power dynamic had flipped. Aaron still hadn't spoken. Teyana still hadn't exposed anything publicly. But the silence between them was no longer protective, it was tense. Loaded. Acknowledged. Because once someone lets you know they could speak, and chooses not to, every quiet moment after that becomes a warning. And the most shocking part. Teyana allegedly didn't need to say a word for the threat to work. As the second phase unfolded, the tension stopped being about what Teyana Taylor might say and became about why she didn't have to. Insiders say this was the moment the balance of power truly shifted, not through exposure, but through anticipation. When someone knows you're holding context that changes the story, every silence becomes loaded. According to sources close to both sides, Pierre allegedly understood exactly what Teyana was referring to. Not a single incident. Not a scandal. A pattern. A pattern of emotional distance paired with strategic proximity. Of letting ambiguity do the heavy lifting while others absorbed the emotional cost. And once that pattern was named privately, it couldn't be unseen. This is where the alleged threat became more unsettling than any reveal ever could. Teyana didn't outline details. She didn't list examples. She simply made it clear she would no longer allow the public narrative to frame her as impulsive or controlling while his restraint went unquestioned. According to insiders, she communicated this calmly, almost clinically, which made it land harder. Calm threats are rarely bluffs. They are boundaries. Aaron's response during this phase reportedly wasn't defensive, it was cautious. People close to him noticed a shift in how he moved. Fewer appearances. More controlled language. Less reliance on silence as virtue and more reliance on avoidance. That distinction mattered. Silence that feels confident reads differently than silence that feels guarded. Insiders say Aaron began realizing something critical. The version of the story that had protected him required Teyana's continued cooperation. Not her endorsement, her discretion. And discretion, once withdrawn, leaves gaps that can't be filled with discipline or professionalism alone. This is where the industry chatter intensified. People who had previously framed Aaron as the quiet, wronged one, began reconsidering how much of that framing depended on what Teyana didn't say. They started asking why she had been carrying the emotional narrative alone. Why her decisiveness was framed as volatility, while his distance was framed as integrity. Those questions didn't accuse, they destabilized. Insiders say Teyana felt that shift too. For the first time, she wasn't pushing against a wall of assumption. The wall was cracking on its own. And that allowed her to step back instead of stepping forward. She didn't need to correct the story loudly, she only needed to stop cushioning it. This phase also reframed the idea of the secret. It wasn't a hidden behavior. It wasn't a dramatic contradiction. It was the knowledge that Aaron's image depended on asymmetry, on being perceived without being examined. Once Teyana recognized that, the leverage became obvious. The secret wasn't something she could expose. It was something she could stop protecting. According to insiders, that's why no explosive moment ever came. Teyana allegedly understood that revealing specifics would invite debate, denial, and distraction. But allowing people to notice the imbalance themselves would have a longer shelf life. She chose patience over spectacle. And that choice made Aaron's silence feel different to observers, less principled, more strategic. Fans picked up on it subtly. The language online changed. Support became conditional. Sympathy became analytical. Instead of asking, "What did he do?" people began asking, "Why does the story feel incomplete?" And incompleteness is dangerous when you've built a narrative on implication. Insiders claim Aaron attempted to recalibrate during this phase, not by confronting Teyana, but by tightening his image. More emphasis on discipline. More emphasis on focus. More emphasis on not engaging in drama. But the problem was timing. Those values, once neutral, now felt defensive. Because when values are emphasized after scrutiny begins, they sound like justification. Teyana, meanwhile, maintained distance. No interviews. No cryptic posts. No subtle digs. That restraint wasn't passive, it was intentional. She wasn't reacting. She was letting the narrative recalibrate without her intervention. And in doing so, she forced the spotlight to linger where it had never lingered before, on Aaron's choices. This is what insiders mean when they say the threat shocked people. Not because it was loud, but because it was effective. The knowledge that Teyana could speak, and was choosing not to, reframed every moment of Aaron's silence. It turned restraint into risk. It made the audience lean in instead of lean away. And once that happens, control becomes fragile. By the end of this phase, nothing had been exposed publicly. And yet, everything felt different. The narrative no longer belonged to Aaron. It no longer needed Teyana's clarification. It was evolving on its own. And that's the most dangerous position to be in, when the story is changing, and the person who knows the most has decided the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be understood. By the time the third phase arrived, the story no longer needed a reveal to be explosive. The damage wasn't waiting on confirmation, it was unfolding through absence. This was the stage where the audience stopped asking what Teyana Taylor might say and started understanding why she didn't need to say anything at all. Because when silence changes meaning, the truth begins to surface on its own. Insiders say this was the moment Aaron Pierre's carefully maintained posture stopped working. Not because anyone exposed him directly, but because the conditions that made his silence read as integrity no longer existed. Once Teyana withdrew protection, not affection, not respect, but narrative shielding, the framework collapsed. The same behaviors that once earned him praise now invited scrutiny. And scrutiny is relentless. People began noticing patterns they'd never questioned before. How Aaron's image relied heavily on being interpreted rather than explained. How his values were always presented in abstraction, discipline, privacy, focus, but rarely anchored to accountability. How the story of the relationship had always been told around him, never by him. That wasn't deception. But it was design. And design becomes visible once the person who kept it balanced steps away. Insiders say Teyana understood this better than anyone. She allegedly realized that saying too much would dilute the power of the truth she held. Details invite debate. Debate invites distraction. Distraction recenters the narrative on spectacle instead of structure. So she chose the more devastating option. She let the imbalance stand uncovered. She let people notice how much of the story only made sense when she stayed quiet. That choice shocked people who expected fireworks. Because what she threatened wasn't exposure, it was withdrawal. The removal of context that had protected a version of events favorable to Aaron. And once that context was gone, the audience began filling in the gaps with questions he wasn't prepared to answer without breaking the very image he'd built. Insiders claim this is when Aaron's silence began costing him. Not publicly, but reputationally. Industry conversations shifted tone. Praise became careful. Curiosity replaced certainty. The assumption that he was simply the private, principled party dissolved into a more complicated assessment. A man who understood how to benefit from proximity without absorbing consequence. Again, not criminal. Not scandalous. But destabilizing. Because credibility isn't lost by being imperfect. It's lost by being incomplete. And once the audience sensed that Teyana had been carrying the emotional and narrative burden alone, they began re-evaluating who really bore the cost of that relationship. Teyana, according to insiders, found peace in that recalibration. This phase wasn't about revenge. It was about self-correction. She reportedly accepted that she didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to stop compensating for a story that minimized her agency while maximizing his grace. That acceptance freed her from reaction. And reaction, in public narratives, is often the trap. The most shocking element of the alleged threat was how little it required to work. No documents. No interviews. No accusations. Just the knowledge, shared quietly, that if Teyana spoke, the story would no longer favor simplicity. And simplicity is the lifeblood of clean images. Once that's threatened, even silence becomes unstable. Observers noticed the shift in Aaron's presence. The confidence that once felt grounded now felt measured. The restraint that once felt noble now felt cautious. Not because he had something terrible to hide, but because he knew the framing had changed, and he no longer controlled it. This is where the idea of the secret finally clarified. The secret wasn't a behavior. It wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't a hidden relationship. It was the truth that the relationship functioned asymmetrically, emotionally real to one side, strategically safe to the other. And once that truth was acknowledged privately, it couldn't be reburied publicly. Teyana's decision not to speak became the final statement. By refusing to engage, she forced the audience to engage differently. They stopped waiting for a confession and started analyzing the structure. They noticed how often she was framed as reactive while he was framed as restrained. How often she was expected to explain while he was expected to be understood. That expectation, once visible, collapsed. Insiders say this is when the threat truly landed. Not as fear, but as inevitability. Aaron didn't need to be exposed to lose control of the narrative. He only needed to lose the protection that made his silence look virtuous. Once that protection disappeared, the story began asking him questions he couldn't answer without revealing the imbalance Teyana had lived inside. And so he stayed quiet. But this time, the quiet wasn't generous. It wasn't grounding. It was conspicuous. As the dust settled, no dramatic conclusion arrived. No winner was declared. No villain unmasked. What remained was something far more unsettling, a realization about how power works in relationships shaped by visibility. Sometimes the most shocking threat isn't "I'll tell." It's "I won't cover anymore." Because once someone stops covering for a narrative that protected you, the truth doesn't need volume. It doesn't need proof. It doesn't even need to be spoken. It reveals itself in what no longer makes sense. And in this case, what no longer made sense was the story everyone had been told, until the person who knew it best decided silence was no longer her responsibility. If you're still here, then you already understand why this story hit differently. This wasn't about a messy breakup, or a shocking confession. It was about power, silence, and who's been carrying the weight of a story that never belonged to them alone. Once you see how quietly narratives are protected, you can't unsee it. And this isn't over. The most important moments are still unfolding off camera, in who stays silent, who suddenly becomes careful, and who never corrects the record, because correcting it would raise more questions than answers. Those are the moments that decide how this story will be remembered. Miss them, and you'll only get the watered-down version later. So don't step away now. Like this video, so it doesn't get buried under comfortable takes and rewritten timelines. Subscribe so you'll hear when the next shift happens, because it won't come as a headline, it'll come as a change in behavior. And comment, because these narratives are shaped by people paying attention before the story gets cleaned up. This wasn't about